Imagine trusting your own child, believing they are perfect, only to find out the truth is darker than you could ever imagine. In tonight's chilling tale, a mother's love is betrayed by the one person she thought would never hurt her. But what happens when the perfect son becomes the perfect monster? Stay tuned to witness the shocking twist that no one saw coming, because in this story, not even love can save you. Don't blink, or you'll miss the terrifying truth. Xiyu's mother loved him with everything she had. She believed he was perfect. She cherished him, doted on him. Her life was a delicate balance of his needs, his desires. She could never imagine that he, the child she had nurtured, would be the one to end it all. The sun was just starting to dip behind the horizon, casting long shadows across the room. Her kitchen smelled of garlic, onions, and simmering stew. She hummed as she stirred the pot, lost in the comfort of the moment. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the old floorboards. It was peaceful. Then, a sound shattered the tranquility. A soft, tentative knock on the door. She froze, the spoon hanging in midair. It was unlike any knock she had ever heard. Not urgent, not familiar. She wiped her hands on her apron, a small frown crossing her face. Who would be at the door at this hour? She opened it slowly, just a crack. Her son stood there, his face unreadable. Her heart skipped a beat. There was something wrong, but she couldn't place it. He stepped inside without a word. She watched as he walked past her, his movements deliberate. She could feel her pulse quicken, but she forced a smile. "Dinner's almost ready, Xieyu. Come sit." He didn't answer. Not a word. He only continued walking, disappearing into the dark hallway. The air felt heavier now, thicker. Her mind raced, but she pushed the unease aside. It was just a moment of worry. A mother's instinct. That was all. Yet, as she moved to follow him, she noticed something strange. The hallway light flickered, casting erratic shadows along the walls. For a moment, she thought she saw something on the floor. A glint of silver. A knife. Her stomach dropped. Her heart started to pound. No, it couldn't be. She didn't want to believe it. But then she heard it. A soft sound, like something being set down gently. Her breath hitched. Was that a sound of someone being placed with care? Or something being discarded? The silence that followed felt suffocating. Every fiber of her being screamed to turn around, to run, but her legs felt frozen to the floor. She should have known. She should have realized sooner. But she hadn't. Her son, the perfect child, was no longer the child she had raised. He was something else now. And in that moment, her world, the world she had built around her love for him, started to crumble. She took a cautious step forward, her breath shallow. Each step felt heavier, as though the air itself was thick with dread. Her heart pounded louder, a frantic beat echoing in her ears. She reached the end of the hallway, where the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally. It felt colder here, the temperature dropping without explanation. Her eyes darted from one corner to the other, looking for him. Then she saw him, standing still. He wasn't facing her. He was staring out of the window, as if lost in thought. His shoulders were rigid, tense, and the silence, it was suffocating. "Xieyu," she called, her voice trembling. No response. She moved closer, her footsteps soft on the floor. She reached out, her hand trembling as she touched his shoulder. He didn't flinch. He didn't even acknowledge her presence. She swallowed hard. This was wrong. Everything about this moment was wrong. She wanted to scream, to ask him what was going on. But her words stuck in her throat. And then he turned. His eyes met hers. Cold. Empty. There was no warmth in them. No love. Just a hollow gaze that sent a chill down her spine. Her breath caught in her throat. "Xieyu," she whispered again, desperate for any sign of the boy she once knew. He didn't answer. He just stared at her unblinking. The room seemed to close in on her, the walls pressing down. And that's when she saw it. The knife, gleaming in his hand. Her heart skipped a beat. Her body froze. She wanted to run, to scream, but her legs wouldn't move. She could barely breathe. He took a step forward, his eyes never leaving hers. A slow, deliberate step. And then, the air was filled with the sound of his voice, low and calm. "You always said you loved me, didn't you?" She nodded, her voice caught in her throat. "I do," she whispered. A faint smile tugged at the corners of his lips. But there was no warmth in it. Only coldness. A void that seemed to swallow everything around it. "You loved me, but you never understood me." Her mind raced, but she couldn't find the words to say. "What he's saying, Xieyu?" she managed to ask, her voice shaking. His gaze hardened. "I've been perfect, haven't I?" he continued, his voice still eerily calm. "I've done everything you wanted, everything you expected of me. But none of that was ever for you, was it?" She blinked, confusion flooding her thoughts. I don't understand, Xu." A cold laugh escaped his lips. "Oh, you'll understand soon enough," he said, his voice growing darker. And then, in a sudden, horrifying moment, he stepped toward her. The knife glinted in the dim light. Before she could react, before she could scream, he lunged. The world seemed to slow, her heart racing in her chest as she saw the gleaming blade come closer. She tried to step back, but her body refused to move. Her mind screamed, but her mouth was dry, silent. The knife was so close now. She could feel the cold steel of it, as if it was already cutting through the air toward her. In that moment, all she could see was him, her son, his face so eerily calm, like nothing was wrong. He moved with precision, like he had rehearsed it 1,000 times. And then, in the blink of an eye, the cold metal touched her skin. A sharp pain shot through her, and she gasped. Her knees buckled beneath her, and she collapsed to the ground. Her fingers instinctively went to the wound, but it was no use. The pain was unbearable. Her vision blurred, but through the haze, she saw his face. Still, there was no emotion, just that unsettling cold stare. He looked down at her as she struggled to breathe, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes. It wasn't anger. It wasn't hatred. It was indifference. She reached out weakly, her hand trembling as it moved toward him. "Xieyu," she whispered, the name slipping from her lips like a prayer. But he didn't respond. He just stood there, watching her, as if she was nothing more than an inconvenience. The seconds stretched, every breath a struggle. She tried to call out again, but her voice was barely a rasp. Her vision was fading, the world around her darkening. She couldn't understand. How could this be happening? How could the son she loved do this? Her thoughts were fractured, slipping away like sand through her fingers. And then, just before the darkness took her completely, she heard him speak once more. "You should have known better, Mother." His voice was almost disappointed, as if she had failed him in some way.
But there was no time for that now.
She was slipping away. The world, once full of warmth, now felt empty, cold, and distant. Everything she had known, everything she had worked for, was now unraveling before her. And her son, her perfect son, stood there, watching her die. Her last breath escaped her, weak and shallow. And with that, the life she had built, the love she had poured into him, was gone. Wu Xieyu stood over her body, staring at the still form of the woman who had once given him everything. His expression remained unchanged.
Perfect.
He was perfect. The silence that followed was suffocating. Wu Xieyu didn't move. He didn't show any sign of remorse. His eyes remained cold, lifeless. His mother, once vibrant, was now nothing more than a hushed memory. He stood there for what felt like hours, watching the stillness of her body, his thoughts distant. There was no regret, no sorrow, just a quiet understanding. This was the only way, the only thing left to do. With slow, deliberate movements, he wiped the knife clean, not even glancing at the blood that stained it. He set it down carefully, as if it was a tool he had used for an important task. Everything was methodical.
Come.
When he turned to leave, the house, the home that had once been filled with love and laughter, felt emptier than ever. The air was heavy, thick with the weight of what had just occurred. His footsteps echoed as he walked down the hall, each step a reminder that nothing was ever going to be the same again. He reached the door, hesitating for a moment as he glanced back toward the room he had just left. Then, with a final, quiet breath, he stepped outside. The cool night air hit him, the crisp wind a sharp contrast to the warmth of the home he had just abandoned. He walked into the darkness, the shadows swallowing him whole. His mind was eerily calm. As he moved further away, the lights of the house grew dimmer. And soon, the house itself was just another silhouette in the distance. Wu Xiu had no plans to return. He knew what he had to do now. The perfect son had done his part, and the world, cruel and unforgiving, would never know the truth. It was the perfect crime. He had become the perfect predator. And his mother? She was nothing more than a casualty of his ambition. The night felt endless as Wu Xiu walked further into the darkness. His footsteps seemed to fade, swallowed by the cold, indifferent world around him. The stars above were bright, distant, but offered no comfort, no solace. He moved through the streets, his face a mask of indifference, his mind a maze of quiet thoughts. The world he had known, the life he had lived, was now irrelevant. His mother's death was a distant echo, nothing more than a necessary step. He had crossed the line, but that line was now a part of him, a cold truth that settled deep within. He passed by homes with lights on, families gathering for dinner, unaware of the horror that had just unfolded. The contrast was almost laughable. How easy it was to blend in, to disappear. How easy it was to walk away. His hands, still stained with the memory of what he had done, remained steady, his grip unwavering. His thoughts drifted, but not to regret, not to guilt. No, his thoughts were focused on the next move, the next step in his carefully crafted plan. He had already considered every possibility, every detail. He had always been prepared. But now, in the stillness of the night, there was no plan. There was only the future. And the future was a world where he could shape it as he saw fit. A world where his mother's love was no longer a constraint. A world where he was free. He reached the edge of the city, where the lights were few and the shadows deeper. It was here that he could vanish, slip away unnoticed, without a trace. His destination was clear. He had no need to hurry. The world could wait. His pulse remained steady, as if nothing had changed. As if the life he had just taken had never mattered. But deep down there was a flicker, a whisper of doubt. Not fear, not regret, but something else. Something unfamiliar. He ignored it. He had made his choice. And nothing, not even the faintest whisper of a conscience, would stop him now. Wu Xiu vanished into the night, and the world moved on, unaware of the perfect monster walking among them. Wu Xiu had disappeared, gone into the depths of the city, where nobody would think to look. For a while, it seemed as though nothing had changed. The world continued to turn, oblivious to the horror that had unfolded. But the silence he left behind lingered. A silence that didn't sit right. A silence that weighed heavy on the places he had left. Days passed. Life moved forward in its usual rhythm. But something had shifted deep within him. He had anticipated this, the coldness, the detachment. What he hadn't prepared for, though, was the creeping sensation that began to coil around his mind. It wasn't fear. It wasn't guilt. But there was something else, something that gnawed at him in the quiet moments. As he sat in the dark corners of the world he now inhabited, it was hard to ignore. There were no loving words to drown it out. No mother's voice calling him back. There was only his own voice in the stillness. And for the first time, it sounded unfamiliar. But he dismissed it quickly. There was no time for doubt. No time for hesitation. He had things to do. Wu Xiu became a ghost. He moved through the city like a shadow, blending in with the people who never noticed him. He had learned how to keep his distance, how to hide behind the mask of normalcy. The perfect son was gone. But the perfect person? That was something he could become. He continued his life, or what passed for it, always on the move, always calculating. But the whispers, the fleeting moments of doubt, would not let him go completely. It was when he found himself standing before a new opportunity that the whisper became louder. A chance, perhaps, to make a mark, to step into a new world where he could shape everything around him. And in that moment, when the offer was made, something powerful, something dangerous, he paused. It was just a flicker, a second of hesitation. But it was enough to make him reconsider. What had he become? It didn't matter. The world had no idea who he was. It didn't know the truth of his past, of the mother he had killed. No one would ever know. And with that thought, the whisper quieted. Wu Xiu took the step forward, and the world moved on, unaware of the dark force that had slipped quietly into its midst. Time passed, and Wu Xiu's life unfolded in a new, quiet rhythm. He had learned to embrace his new reality, to weave himself into the fabric of the world he had once only observed from a distance. He became a ghost in plain sight, a shadow moving among the living. But even in his perfect silence, there was always a crack, a tiny fracture in the mask he wore. Something would catch his attention now and then. A flash of someone's gaze. A smile that seemed too genuine. A moment of warmth he no longer understood. But he had long since learned to bury those feelings, to push them back where they belonged. Because the world didn't care. It didn't care about a son who had killed his mother. It didn't care about the boy who had once been perfect, but had traded his soul for freedom. And that freedom came with its price. The things that used to matter, his mother's love, the life they had shared, felt distant now, like a story told long ago, fading with time. He kept moving, always in control. But the unease, the flickering doubt, it never went away. It was like an itch beneath his skin. The harder he tried to ignore it, the stronger it became. One evening, as he sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, something felt off. The stillness of the night was more oppressive than usual. It pressed in on him, tighter, suffocating. He sat at the small desk, staring at a letter in front of him. An unexpected letter. It had arrived that morning, marked with an unfamiliar address. His fingers trembled slightly as he unfolded the paper. And then he read. A name. His mother's name. The ink on the page was fresh, the words sharp, clear. Dear Wu Xiu. The rest was a blur. His eyes darted across the page, his heart pounding as the words started to sink in. They were words he didn't expect to see. A letter from someone who knew. Someone who had uncovered the truth. The letter ended with a single line, written in a hurried, almost frantic hand. I know what you did, and I will make sure the world knows. His blood ran cold. For the first time in years, Wu Xiu felt something more than the faintest tremor of fear. He was being hunted. The perfect mask he had so carefully constructed was starting to crack. And this time, there would be no escaping it. No more shadows. No more silence. He was no longer the hunter. Someone else had taken that role. And now, for the first time, Wu Xiu understood the weight of what he had done. But it was too late. Too late to turn back. The letter trembled in Wu Xiu's hand as his mind raced, each thought a blur of confusion and panic. Who could possibly know? Who had uncovered the truth? The words echoed in his ears, repeating like a haunting refrain. I know what you did, A cold sweat slicked his skin as the room seemed to shrink around him. The perfect facade he had built, the life he had so carefully molded to hide his monstrous secret, was it all falling apart now? His breathing grew shallow as his thoughts spiraled. Who could this be? Was it someone from the past? A forgotten witness? The uncertainty gnawed at him, and for the first time, he felt exposed. Vulnerable. His hands shook as he crumpled the letter, throwing it across the room. But the words still echoed, louder now, taunting him. I know what you did. His mind snapped back to that night. The cold, hollow stare in his mother's eyes as he ended her life. He had thought it was over, that he could walk away, move on, like it had never happened. But now it seemed someone had been watching. Someone who knew. He stood up abruptly, pacing the room, his mind racing faster than his feet. What was the next move? How could he stop this? His eyes flicked toward the window, to the dim streetlights below. His life, the life of the perfect child, was built on lies, and it was about to come crashing down. The world was on the edge of discovering the monster he had become. He had no choice now but to act, to protect himself, no matter the cost. A plan began to form in his mind, cold and calculated, like everything else he had ever done. He couldn't leave this to chance. Whoever was behind this letter had to be stopped before it was too late. But there was something else, something darker that crept into his thoughts, a sense of anticipation, a twisted thrill at the idea of what came next. He had always been the perfect son, the perfect student, the perfect child. But now he was becoming something else, something much darker. The line between predator and prey was blurring, and Xieyu was no longer sure where he stood. As the night deepened, his eyes narrowed. The game had changed, and he was ready to play, whatever it took. He moved toward the door, his face a mask of calm. But beneath the surface, a storm was brewing. The endgame had begun, and no one was going to stop him. Xieyu stood in front of the mirror, his reflection cold and detached. He studied his own face, the face of a boy who had once been perfect, the boy who had killed his mother. The mask he had worn for so long now felt like it was slipping. The thrill he had once felt in controlling everything, his life, his actions, the world around him, was now replaced with something darker, something twisted. The letter had shattered the calm he had carefully crafted. He had thought he could escape, that no one would ever uncover the truth.
But now someone knew.
Someone had pieces of his past, and they were closing in. The fear, that gnawing terror, began to creep back into his chest, but he pushed it aside. Fear was a weakness, and Xieyu couldn't afford weaknesses.
Not now.
He had come so far. He had taken everything he wanted, everything he needed, and no one had ever questioned him.
But now?
Now things were different. He was no longer in control. That letter, the ominous warning, had set a new course in motion. He couldn't let anyone expose him. He couldn't let this shadow from his past destroy everything he had worked for. His fingers clenched into fists, his jaw tightening with resolve. The game wasn't over yet. The world was still his to shape. He had the power to silence any threat. He just had to act first. Xieyu walked toward the door, every step purposeful, every move calculated. His mind was already working, planning his next move. There were no more second chances. No more room for hesitation. If he wanted to keep his perfect life, his perfect world, he would have to make sure that whoever was behind that letter would never threaten him again. The silence of the apartment pressed in on him. But now, the silence felt like an ally. It was the calm before the storm. As he stepped out into the night, the world felt strangely quiet, as if everything had paused for just a moment. But he knew better. It was not the calm before the storm. It was the storm itself. And Xieyu was ready to face it head-on. The perfect son, the perfect monster, and now the perfect predator. The city lights flickered as Wu Xiyu walked through the streets, his steps measured and deliberate. The weight of the letter, those few simple words, had not left his mind since he read them. I know what you did, but he would not let it control him. He would not be cornered. Not again. He had spent years perfecting his life, each choice deliberate, each move calculated to protect the secret of what he had done. And yet here he was, still haunted by it, still running from the consequences. The shadows felt like old friends now, but even they couldn't shield him forever. As he reached a dark alley, the air grew heavier, and he sensed a presence. Someone was watching him. He knew it. The letter had been a warning, but now it felt like the final piece of the puzzle was about to fall into place. He turned sharply, his heart pounding. And there, standing in the corner of the alley, was a figure he hadn't expected. It was not who he thought it would be. A woman, older, with tired eyes that held a quiet intensity. She stood still, her gaze fixed on him. For a moment, they just stared at each other, as if sizing each other up. Wu Xiyu's mind raced, trying to assess her, to figure out what she knew. But before he could speak, she broke the silence. I told you, she said softly. I know what you did. Her voice was calm, measured, no anger, no fear. Just the quiet weight of certainty. Wu Xiyu's breath hitched. Who are you? He demanded, his voice sharp, his grip tightening on the cold metal of his knife. The woman's gaze never wavered. I'm someone who's been watching you for a long time, she replied. You thought you could hide. But you can't. His pulse quickened. She knew. And she had known for far too long. You don't have to do this, she added, her voice suddenly softer, almost sad. You've already lost everything, Xieyu. The question is, what's left to destroy? Her words cut deeper than any blade he had ever held. A quiet, uncomfortable truth that settled in his chest. He looked at her, his mind reeling, but there was no escape. In that moment, Wu Xiyu understood. He had been running from his past, from the truth of what he had done. But the truth had always been chasing him. And now, standing in front of him, it had finally caught up. The mask he had worn for so long, the perfect son, the perfect monster, had shattered. There was no more control, no more perfect world. Just him, alone, and the weight of everything he had destroyed. As the woman stepped back into the shadows, Wu Xiyu stood frozen, a man lost in his own creation. The storm he had started had come full circle, and now it was over. For the first time, he didn't know who he was anymore. And as the night swallowed him whole, there was no one left to watch. No one left to hide from. Just the echoes of his own choices.